How avoidants fall apart after losing someone who actually carried. Let's talk about something few people admit, but many experience in silence. When someone with avoidant tendencies, someone who spent most of their life pushing people away or keeping them at arm's length, finally meets someone who actually cares and then loses them, it breaks them in a way they never expected. You see, avoidants often wear emotional armor. They've learned, sometimes through trauma, sometimes through subtle patterns, that closeness equals vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe. So they avoid, not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much overwhelms them. When someone comes along who's patient, present, and emotionally available, that person slowly becomes a mirror, not just of what love could be, but of what the avoidant has been avoiding their entire life: intimacy. And in the beginning, they'll resist it. They'll minimize it. They'll tell themselves, this is too much. But they stay because for once it feels different. It feels safe. Until one day, often because of their own withdrawal, emotional distance, or hot and cold behavior, that caring person finally walks away. That's when it happens. The avoidant doesn't fall apart immediately. No, they often feel relief, space, freedom. They may even convince themselves, see, I knew this wouldn't work, but give it time. Give it a few weeks, a few months. Suddenly, they're haunted by what they pushed away. Not just the person, but the feeling of being truly seen, of being loved without condition, of having someone choose them. Now, they're left in a vacuum, not because the other person abandoned them, but because they couldn't let themselves receive what was offered. And here's the tragedy. They'll remember the love, but rewrite it in their mind as something they weren't ready for. They'll call it too much, instead of recognizing it was exactly what they needed. Avoidants don't fall apart when they're alone. They fall apart when they realize they lost someone who stayed when they kept running. So if you're someone who cared for an avoidant and walked away because you had to protect your peace, I need you to hear this. You weren't too much. You were the one thing they didn't know how to handle real love. And if you're the avoidant who let someone good slip away, this isn't your punishment. It's your awakening. Now is your chance to choose growth over regret. Because the only thing scarier than letting love in is realizing you pushed it away and might never get it back. Avoidants often resist love, not because they don't care, but because real closeness feels dangerous. This is something that confuses the people who love them the most. To the outside world, it may seem like they are cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But beneath that exterior is usually someone who feels things deeply, sometimes too deeply, and who has learned, often from childhood or early experiences, that getting close means getting hurt. Love becomes associated not with warmth and safety, but with unpredictability, rejection, or the fear of being consumed. At some point in their life, the avoidant adapted by learning to self-soothe, to rely only on themselves, and to keep others at a distance. This isn't because they think they're better off alone. It's because being alone feels safer. Control becomes everything. The more control they have over their emotional environment, the less likely they are to feel vulnerable, and closeness threatens that control. So when someone comes along who offers them genuine love, consistent, calm, patient, it creates an internal conflict, a war between what they want and what they're terrified of. The avoidant will often subconsciously test the person who cares for them. They'll pull away when things get too intimate. They might become critical, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable, not to push the person away out of cruelty, but as a defense mechanism. In their mind, love that gets too close becomes dangerous. So they create space as a way to breathe, to keep the feelings from becoming too overwhelming. And yet, that very space is what erodes the relationship over time. What makes this especially heartbreaking is that avoidants do feel love. They just don't always know how to do love. They may care deeply for someone but feel suffocated when that person wants to be emotionally close. They may crave connection but interpret it as a loss of independence. So they send mixed signals. One moment, they're all in. The next, they're withdrawn. This inconsistency isn't meant to confuse. It's a reflection of their internal struggle. They're caught between the desire for love and the fear of it. The partner who loves them often doesn't understand why they're being held at arm's length, especially when they've done nothing wrong. They offer empathy, support, and affection only to be met with walls and distance. The more they try to connect, the more the avoidant may retreat. It's not that they don't recognize the value of what's being offered. It's that receiving it means they have to confront the vulnerability they've spent a lifetime avoiding. And this is where it all begins to fall apart, because the very thing that could help them heal, intimacy, emotional availability, authentic connection, is the thing they are most likely to reject. Not because they want to be alone, but because love to them is unfamiliar territory. It's something they never fully learned how to accept without fear, so they resist it. They push it away. They try to stay safe. And in doing so, they often lose the person who simply wanted to love them. When someone who genuinely cares finally walks away from an avoidant, the collapse doesn't happen all at once. In fact, it rarely looks like devastation at first. It often starts with a strange and deceptive sense of relief. The pressure is gone. There are no more emotional demands, no more uncomfortable conversations about feelings, no more moments where the avoidant feels backed into a corner by intimacy. There's space again, freedom, even. And in that initial quiet, the avoidant may tell themselves they made the right decision or that the other person simply wasn't a good fit. They might rationalize the breakup by focusing on minor conflicts or tell themselves they just weren't ready. On the surface, it seems like peace, but beneath that peace is the beginning of a slow unraveling. Avoidants are used to operating in self-protective mode. They've spent so much time keeping their emotions at bay that they've become good at numbing discomfort. So when the person who once brought warmth, stability, and care finally leaves, the avoidant's first instinct is not to grieve, but to detach. That detachment, however, is only temporary, because the emotional bond doesn't disappear just because they didn't fully express it. It lingers. And over time, the absence of the person who cared for them begins to take shape in unexpected ways. A song, a place, a phrase the other person used to say. These things start to pull on a thread the avoidant thought they had cut clean. They begin to feel a quiet sense of loss they don't immediately know how to name. It's not just about missing a person. It's about missing how they were seen, how they were accepted, how someone stayed even when they made it difficult. Eventually, the avoidant starts to realize that the space they once craved now feels empty. The silence they once called freedom now echoes with regret. The tragedy is that this realization often comes too late. By the time the avoidant sees what they had, the person who cared has likely spent months or even years trying to make it work. They offered reassurance. They tried to understand. They reached out again and again until they were drained. And when they finally left, it wasn't because they stopped caring. It was because they had to care for themselves. This delayed emotional fallout is part of what makes loss so confusing for avoidants. They don't fall apart right away because they've built their entire identity around not needing anyone. But the truth is, they did need that person. They just didn't know how to admit it. And once the person is gone, there's no longer a buffer between them and the emotions they've been avoiding. What used to feel like protection begins to feel like isolation. What once looked like strength begins to look like fear. And so long after the goodbye has been said, the real grief begins. Not just for the person they lost, but for the version of themselves that couldn't let love in when it was right there, asking to be received. When an avoidant loses someone who genuinely cared for them, the loss becomes more than just the absence of a person. It becomes a painful confrontation with everything they've tried to suppress. The relationship, whether they realized it at the time or not, served as a mirror. The person who loved them didn't just offer affection, they offered insight. They reflected back what the avoidant had buried deep beneath layers of self-protection. The longing for connection, the fear of vulnerability, the discomfort with emotional intimacy. When that mirror is taken away, the avoidant is left not only with a sense of emptiness, but also with a flood of awareness they can no longer escape. This is why the aftermath feels so intense. It's not just the individual they're missing. It's the safety, the steadiness, and the emotional presence that came with that person. It's the realization that someone truly saw them, perhaps in a way no one else ever had, and they couldn't or wouldn't let it in. That kind of recognition doesn't go away when a relationship ends. It lingers. It forces the avoidant to acknowledge how much they needed something they spent so long pretending they didn't want. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant likely struggled with conflicting emotions. A part of them wanted to be close, to trust, to relax into the comfort of someone's care, but that desire was always battling the internal fear that closeness would cost them something: autonomy, control, or even their sense of identity. So they withdrew. They shut down during emotional conversations. They created distance to protect themselves. But each time they did that, they unknowingly chipped away at the connection. Eventually, the person who loved them grew tired, not because they didn't care, but because they felt alone in the relationship. Once the relationship is over, the avoidant is left with silence, deafening silence that allows all the things they ignored or minimized to rise to the surface. The care they once dismissed now becomes precious in hindsight. The patience they overlooked now feels rare. And the emotional availability they once found overwhelming is suddenly something they crave. The very things they ran from are now the things they mourn. This shift is what breaks them, not the immediate ending, but the delayed realization of what they had and how their own behavior contributed to its loss. There is no one left to push against, no emotional stimulus to manage or avoid. It's just them alone with the echo of what was offered and the memory of what they couldn't accept. The love they once saw as too much is now remembered as something irreplaceable. And in this space, the truth becomes harder to ignore. They weren't being attacked by love, they were being invited to heal. But instead of accepting that invitation, they ran. And now, with nothing left but reflection, they're forced to see the consequences of their distance. Not as punishment, but as a painful mirror showing them what they've been running from all along. This experience isn't a punishment, it's a wake-up call. That's the part avoidants rarely recognize at first. When the person who loved them is gone and they're left in the silence that follows, it's tempting to view the pain as something cruel or unfair. But in reality, it's not the universe being harsh, it's reality stepping in to offer clarity. For maybe the first time, they're being asked to confront themselves, not as victims of failed relationships, but as active participants in their own patterns of disconnection. The weight of that is heavy. But it's also necessary, because pain, when faced honestly, becomes a turning point. The avoidant has built much of their emotional world around avoidance itself, around minimizing risk, protecting their independence, and dodging the discomfort of vulnerability. These strategies may have once served a purpose. Maybe they were survival tools in an environment where emotions weren't safe. But over time, these same tools begin to cost them the very thing they secretly long for: connection. So when someone comes into their life who offers love without conditions, someone who simply wants to know them, support them, and share something real, they don't know how to receive it. That love doesn't feel like safety. It feels like danger because it threatens the identity they've constructed around not needing anyone. So when that love leaves, it's not just the loss of a partner, it's the collapse of a system that no longer works. The emotional distance they relied on to feel in control is now the reason they're alone. And in that realization is the opportunity for something rare growth. Because in the pain of losing someone who actually cared, the avoidant is faced with a truth they can't unsee. That love didn't destroy them. In fact, it was the only thing that ever tried to reach them. This moment, as painful as it is, becomes a threshold. They can either fall deeper into their old narratives, blaming the other person, convincing themselves that intimacy just isn't for them, or they can choose a new path. A harder path, one that requires introspection, emotional risk, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. This is where transformation begins, not in the comfort zone, but in the reckoning. The grief they feel isn't a punishment, it's feedback. It's telling them that something about the way they've been doing love isn't working anymore. It's showing them that the walls they thought were protecting them have become a prison. And this isn't about shame. It's not about labeling themselves as broken or uncapable. It's about understanding that healing is possible, but only if they're willing to step toward what scares them. Love is not the enemy. Vulnerability is not weakness. And caring deeply isn't something to be feared. It's something to be learned, practiced, and embraced. But none of that can happen without first waking up to the truth that losing someone who cared is not just a loss. It's an invitation. The biggest tragedy isn't losing someone. It's realizing you were loved and didn't let yourself feel it until it was gone. That truth doesn't hit like a thunderclap. It arrives slowly, creeping in through the quiet moments after the relationship has ended. It shows up in the spaces where that person used to be. In the casual messages that no longer come, the support that's no longer offered, the unconditional presence that is now just a memory. At first, it's easy for the avoidant to tell themselves it's for the best. They weren't ready. The connection was overwhelming. The timing was off. But over time, the excuses wear thin, and what's left is a deep, aching awareness that they were loved in a way that was real and they couldn't let it in. Love, especially the kind that's steady and patient, is rare. And when it's gone, avoidants are often left to reflect not just on the person who walked away, but on their own inability to receive what was freely given. It's not that they didn't feel the love. It's that they never fully allowed themselves to experience it. They kept it at arm's length, questioned it, pulled away from it. They told themselves they didn't need it, or that it was too much. But now that it's no longer available, they begin to see just how deeply it touched them, even if they never said it out loud. The realization that someone loved them not for what they did, but simply for who they were, becomes heavier with time. It exposes the cracks in the armor they've worn for so long. They start to understand that it wasn't the other person's love that was too intense. It was their own fear of being seen, held, and truly known. That love brought them closer to their raw, unguarded self. And instead of leaning in, they pulled back. They mistook safety for pressure, connection for suffocation. And now, in the silence that follows the loss, they begin to wonder what might have been different if they had just let themselves feel it fully. Regret sets in, not only for the person they lost, but for the version of themselves they didn't allow to show up. They think back to the moments they dismissed or shut down, the times they said, "I'm fine," when they weren't, the conversations they avoided, and the walls they built. They realize they weren't protecting themselves from the other person. They were protecting themselves from intimacy. But now there's nothing left to hide from, and the cost of that protection feels unbearable. There's no comfort in knowing they were loved if they never let themselves be loved in return. That love, once inconvenient or overwhelming, now feels like something sacred, and it's gone. That's the heartbreak, not the absence of the other person, but the awareness that love was present, waiting, willing, and they didn't open the door. So what does all this mean? It means that love, when it's real, isn't always easy, especially for those who've spent their lives running from it. But losing someone who genuinely cared has a way of stripping away every excuse, every defense, and every illusion. It forces the avoidant to face what they couldn't while the relationship was still alive. That love doesn't wait forever, and that pushing it away doesn't protect you. It isolates you. But if you're listening to this and you see yourself in these words, this isn't the end of your story. It's the moment you get to decide whether you want to stay in patterns that keep you safe but disconnected, or grow into someone who can actually receive the love you once rejected. Growth